Welcome to Star Narratives, the podcast, where we have thought-provoking conversations with fascinating people, weaving in the astrological elements of their natal chart. We go so much deeper than just astrology for astrology's sake. Hi, I'm your host, Natha Campanella, and I teach people how to use the wisdom of astrology as an emotional health toolkit. Hi, it's Natha. So as you may have noticed, I find myself moving away a little bit from finding specific aspects in people's charts. And perhaps this is just because I have so much mutability in my own chart. And what that means is the mutable planets are the ones that need constant change. Things get very stagnant. And the mutable planets are always troubleshooting and saying, what can I do different? What can I do better? How can I make this better for me? And so I find that happens a lot where I'm constantly troubleshooting because, I don't want to just get into a groove and stay in that groove. And I've noticed when talking to people that there are times when it isn't really necessary to pull out a specific aspect as much as it is to just talk about things that are happening in the chart and be a little bit more vague, but still kind of use them to support what we're talking about. And so my guest today, we're doing that. We do talk about the Pluto square Pluto transit, and I do explain it in the interview as we're talking, but if you are listening to this and you are past the age of 37, 38, 39, look back into your life and see what was happening back then. My guess is there were big things. I don't think I've ever read a chart for a client where their jaw didn't kind of hit the ground when I pulled up the transit diagram and they looked at the dates and said, oh my God, that was when this happened or this happened. And so it is a really big transit, and my guest is in the middle of it. And, Pluto, of course. I'm always talking about Pluto, but Pluto is within all of our charts, and it really is one of the planets that kind of continually pushes us to change and know ourselves on a much deeper level and really examine, what's happening? What are these invisible currents that are sort of flowing through us? And I think oftentimes Pluto stuff will show up as trauma. And the invitation is always to examine and explore and figure out where it's coming from and what we can do about it now. My guest today is Asher Pandjiris. She is a psychotherapist. She works with people in person, but also over video and over the phone. And she works with a lot of people who are working with body stuff, whether it's eating disorders, whether it's trauma and the impact that it's had on the body. She works with a lot of queer and gender nonconforming and trans-bodied people whose bodies are impacted by intergenerational trauma. People that live with chronic health issues and more. She really has a beautiful skill set and a way of really articulating some things that I think will resonate if you're listening. They certainly resonated with me. And I really enjoyed talking to her, and she is starting a new podcast, and I have, we give all the information about that. I know I'll be listening. So yeah, I think I will just leave it there and let you start listening. All right, let's go. Hi, Asher.
Hey, how are you?
I am good. It's so fun to I've heard your voice on your first episode of your new podcast, but it's been really fun to get to talk to you a few minutes before this interview and just get to see you and meet you in real life.
I do exist in real life. Yeah. It's nice to actually connect human to human. That feels good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think that a lot of what we'll be talking about today is like body stuff. But before we
Mm,
even jump into that, do you want to share a little bit just about who you are and what you're doing in this very real life of yours?
yes, sure. Um, yeah, well, thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk with you. I feel like it's really interesting for me to, as we'll discuss, but it's really interesting for me to get the perspective of astrology in my life. So it's an interesting kind of frame for all of this. But um, I am a many things, but right now I'm a parent. I am a parent of a almost 10-year old, which is wild. And I am a psychotherapist, and I am in the process, in part because of things that are happening with my body and messages that my body has given me. I'm in the process of kind of shifting how I work as a therapist. I still see patients and really love that work. And I'm also in the process of expanding and contracting certain parts of my life. So expanding in the sense that I'm starting a podcast, which will hopefully speak to more people so that I can kind of reach more people, and not necessarily be seeing as many patients as I was. And I'm working on, doing some workshops and other things that kind of feel enlivening to me in a way. And I'm also prioritizing a lot of taking care of my body and following what my body needs, based on having gone through some pretty more intense health related issues in the past year than I have in the past. So kind of in a process of metabolizing all of that right now.
Yeah. Yeah. When I was looking at your chart,
Hmm.
one of the things that stuck out to me, because this is something that I haven't talked about on the podcast, but we all have these transits that happen,
Mm,
and some of them are considered life cycle transits because we all have them. And something that is currently happening in your chart is called the Pluto square Pluto. And this is
mm,
just when transiting Pluto forms a square to wherever our natal Pluto is. And this is something that happens to all of us, usually between ages about 36 and 39. But it is hugely transformational. Um,
mm,
Pluto is the planet that talks about our instincts. And we all reach this time where we have to really begin to examine our instinctual ways of being in the world and whether we are still sort of motivated by, um, stress response or reactivity, or we're trying to numb our stress.
mm,
Um, or, what Pluto wants us to do is to really become more aware of those things in our lives that we are sort of having stress response to, some of
mm,
the ways that we just maybe aren't seeing ourselves very clearly. And so this transit tends to be a hugely transformational time of sort of walking through the fire. And, I was kind of curious in reading some of your social media shares and also knowing that you are starting this new podcast. I'm assuming that you're in this huge state of transformation, and you just shared a little bit about that. But,
mhm.
you know, after hearing me describe it,
Yeah.
what comes to your mind about where you are
Yeah.
right now in life?
Yeah, it's very validating to hear that this is, that there's some kind of uh there's some kind of, I don't know, like communal experience around confronting some of these issues around this time, with this trends that you're talking about. So, yeah, for sure. The thing that sticks out most to me is this idea of instincts and that word that you used. I think that, we all like to, I think I'll speak for myself. I liked to think that, I really was driving my life based on what my intuition and my instincts were telling me. And I think that there's nothing like a real health crisis, emergency, and a confrontation with the chronicity of my, basically what I experienced is sort of a confrontation with the chronicity of two autoimmune conditions. That just means that I'm, finally confronting, I think, the fact that this is not something that's going to necessarily go away, but rather it's sort of a health um, a health issue, or health issues that are really something that I have to navigate for quite some time, and so I need to confront aspects of it. So I guess when I say all that to say that experience, or this experience more recently, has led me to really realize, or it's illuminated all the ways that I have been kind of ignoring, or feeling certain instincts and tamping them down, as you said, or ignoring these messages that my body is sort of giving me, or my psyche is giving me, that really applies to a lot of aspects of my life, relationships, just lifestyle choices. I've been in a process of kind of quote unquote taking care of myself, or, really centering my self-care for quite some time, but there are lots of more nuanced ways that I think can be done. And right now I'm really in a process of letting go of things that, mostly, honestly, letting go of ideas about myself, or ideas of what should be happening, or what I was planning on happening, and really moving those things aside, so that I can listen to my intuition, and can sort of follow my instincts. And it's been a really interesting process, because part of the reason the podcast is happening, and in a really meaningful way for me, is because I've been really noticing all throughout the process how energizing and exciting the podcast feels to me. And I think in the past, I may have, I don't know, set aside the kind of instinct that would say, wow, follow what you're compelled by, like, you have bills to pay, you need to take care of your kid, really compartmentalizing my life. And I think that when I'm able to listen to my intuition and kind of follow it, you're faced with a whole other set of things that you have to confront about how will people receive this? What will people, what will the world, how will I be in the world differently than how I used to show up in the world? And what will that mean? Those kind of questions come up for sure. But I do feel more clear, I suppose, about returning to some kind of basic notions of how I actually like to live my life, and what works for me.
Yeah, there's a big component of these Pluto transits that involve taking back our power in some way. And it sounds
Mm.
like that's a lot of the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, yeah. In a way, it's interesting to think about it that way, because I've, you know, illness or health issues definitely render me feeling very vulnerable and not in control of my life, in a lot of ways. And yet, I think, in a way, what you're talking about in terms of reclaiming power has actually been a byproduct of this experience as well.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? I see this too, where um, it's almost like our bodies deliver us if we're not listening to our body
Mhm,
and the
mhm.
messages, which are probably coming in for years that we're ignoring, and then it sort of goes the next step into illness or
Mm.
accident or whatever happens, and we at one time feel so totally pissed and vulnerable and like this is not fair and why is this happening, and at the
Mm-hmm.
other time, you're saying stuff like this is teaching you how to let go of ideas about what should happen. And
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about taking our power back, I think I tend to always think of like, I have to take my power back from the man or from someone out there. But God, there's so much that we need to take back from ourselves, really. And these ideas that we need to be conforming and fitting into a certain ideal, and all of these things that just drag us down. And,
Yeah.
I think that you're doing a lot of that work right now. And I would imagine that you have a lot of clients that are also doing that work. And part of
Mm.
this journey for you is like, it's like the next master's degree, right? In like, okay, so this is how you begin to let go. And, maybe your clients don't have to get to the point of illness, or maybe they do.
Mm-hmm.
But, it is all, God, it's also interrelated, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely, yeah, a lot of what you're saying resonates with me. I mean, I think I do want to be careful, because I want to be careful how I'm talking about like sort of the narrative of learning from my illness, or my illness as a guide or teacher or whatever. I mean, it is inevitable that if you live with chronic health issues or pain or anything like that, I think it's inevitable that you certainly end up digging deeper, being forced in some ways to dig deeper into your own internal resources and confront aspects of yourself, in ways that are really actually quite productive and amazing. And I think that is very true to my own experience. I also think that it is difficult to understand, kind of the fine line between learning and being curious about oneself, and also having, I guess, having a sense that some sort of divine intervention has happened, that you know I was ignoring all of these cues, and I was then somehow, kind of, this illness illuminated things in my life that weren't working. All of those things did happen, but I think that for people who have kind of chronic health issues, there's a lot of questions around like the etiology of it or the origins of it. I'm just thinking about this really beautiful piece that I just read in an online journal called Triple Canopy. It's written by this amazing artist, Carolyn Lazard. It's called The World is Unknown. And it's just this reflection on living with chronic, kind of bewildering chronic health issues, autoimmune issues that respond differently to different interventions. And in that piece, they're kind of musing around this idea of like, well, how and why did this happen to me? Is this trauma? Did I have so much trauma in my life that now I'm living with a kind of chronic illness? It's my job to fix it, or my job to repair myself. And just a lot of like really breaks down a lot of the discourses and questions that a lot of people living with more chronic health issues face. So I think that I just want to bring that perspective in too, because I think in the kind of like spiritual, quote unquote, spiritual world, or the wellness world, there are a lot of discourses around, illness as a teacher, or these kind of not just illness, but sort of big life, as you call, like you're talking about it in the context of transits, but these big life events that feel they also just feel really bad. They feel really hard. And I want to bring that in too. I don't want to promote some idea that I'm like, wow, this is my teacher and this has been feeling great. It's been hard won, some of these insights, which I'm sure that you're kind of also can understand that, but I want to be careful how I'm talking about it, because I think it's also important to talk about like the messiness and the difficulty of trying to like get to a place within a healing journey where you actually feel somewhat grateful for the lessons you're learning, because part of it is just such a shit show, like literally it's really hard. So I guess I think there needs to be room for that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what comes to my mind as you're talking is that like you said, there's a lot of, on one hand, there is wisdom to be found from any of these big life events, especially the ones that cause us suffering.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we have to be careful because there's so much, we could call it like law of attraction teachings right now.
Yes.
that are so big. And if we're not careful, those of us, especially those of us that are very prone to being perfectionists and wanting to get it right and wanting to do it right, we can really feel like, oh shit, I did something wrong. And now I have this illness. Or, if I can't fix the illness immediately, then I'm doing something wrong and it's my vibration that's, out of balance. And that gets really tricky too. I mean, is that sort of,
that's
does that complement what you were saying? Okay.
Yes. Thank you for kind of putting it into that framework. Absolutely. And I think that there are other frameworks that even for people who are not kind of more spiritually, inclined around thinking about things like law of attraction teachings, but even, just with the patients I work with, some of whom ascribe to that and whatever, but I think that the bottom line is there are all sorts of ways that we can turn on ourselves when we are feeling vulnerable and blame ourselves or try to kind of fix our way out of discomfort or suffering. And I suppose that one of the things that I've really been relieved to feel recently has been this kind of overwhelming feeling of, okay, this is like, something you hear all the time, but it's like the suffering is going to come and it's going to go and then it's going to come again. It's sort of like my autoimmune disease in a way, like there'll be flares of these things that will come and go, and it won't ever be fixed, like there is no fixing. And I think that that's really something that I have to sit and hold with a lot of my patients who have experienced, like I have, trauma, embodied trauma that affects one's body, and psyche and all sorts of things, but that there isn't a fix for that, and that as a therapist I can't fix that, and I've really deeply felt that in my own life and continue to.
Yeah, I need to I'm taking deep breaths as you're talking, because that's something that is so up for me right now in the I feel like a lot of my clients want to know what the fix is, and a lot of the materials that are out right now are like, you can heal, this can heal, and it's not to say that it can't heal, but the idea that we are able to do something that just makes this, trauma or these memories or this illness sort of just disappear and vanish it's a hard pill to swallow, because it almost seems like you said there's an ebb and a flow. And I see that, when we're talking in astrology and we look at the asteroid called Chiron, and Chiron in the chart talks a lot about our early wounding, our early trauma, and the flavor of it and the way that it shows up. And really we describe it as like that proverbial onion, where it is nothing but layer after layer after layer. You don't just get to the center of the onion and it's like, oh God, finally I'm released from this trauma. But like with an illness, there is much to learn within the different layers and within the flares and within the, simply being as aware as possible to the emotions that it brings up every time you get a trigger or a flare. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the very most powerful things that can happen. But I'm curious about what your thoughts and takes are on this, because you're a
Mm.
professional and you are working with people all the time in this exact realm. So tell
Mm.
me what's coming up for you.
Well, something when you were talking, I thought, I thought of this idea of the distinction between feeling soothed by something or feeling like a practice or a person or something like that can actually in some ways fix the problem or fix the suffering by taking it away, whereas a lot of the practices, predictably, it's no surprise given sort of what I'm talking about, but the practices that actually end up really working for me or feeling helpful are not actually that soothing in a way, right? So they're not like um I'm sick and here's an antibiotic and it'll make it go away in 10 days. It's more around like things like breath work, which I don't breath work is not for everyone, and it's definitely, just as a disclaimer, not for it's complicated and brings up a lot of feelings, and I think for some people who really aren't at all feeling embodied or have a lot of body trauma, it can be, you need to work with someone who really understands that. But that being said, and that turned me off from breath work for quite a while, but breath work, for people who don't know, is like this um well, the practice that I've done a handful of times is like a 3-part breath, and you're kind of led by, at least in my experience, I'm led in a group, and you breathe like that for like 40 minutes, and what you're doing is kind of like active meditation in a way. You're sitting with or laying and breathing with whatever emerges in your kind of more subconscious realm when you are feeling safe enough in the environment to do that. And it's wild. It's not comfortable. I've cried. Some people like yell and scream, and sometimes you're encouraged to do so, and like it's really uncomfortable, and yet there's something so relieving about being able to arrive in a place where all of the different emotions that we all kind of keep dissociated a little bit to get through the day, where you can kind of pull all the parts of yourself together. Like, I'm really sad about this, and I'm really excited about this, and nervous about this person, or really worried about this thing, or all of these thoughts just kind of emerge, and feelings emerge, and you kind of, with your body, I think you metabolize the feelings, and that has been relieving. But if you would have told me, when I'm really, really, I don't know, just really, really sick or really, really upset or feeling really down, that would make me feel better, it's like, no way. But I think there's something about being receptive um, to kind of healing practices or conversations or ways of connecting, and this applies to the way I work as a therapist, and how I try to be with my patients, where there is a lot of permission given to feel and express and actually embody like a wide range of needs and emotions, and that sometimes being soothed is really necessary, and sometimes being kind of held in all of the complexity of what you're feeling is actually what is needed, and sometimes we need each other to help us be brave enough to do that. I certainly do. I mean, I definitely draw on and work with a lot of different people in my own life to kind of help support me in continuing to be brave and courageous in not seeking out a fix or not seeking out something that will kind of numb me out, but really continue to find that kind of relief in acceptance, I guess, that there's suffering and there's wonderful things. They all kind of coexist together. I don't know if that kind of gets at some of what you're
Yeah.
asking.
Well, I mean, what comes to my mind is sort of a very mundane example of, exercise, and
Mm,
how oftentimes it sucks and we don't want to do it. And as we're
mm,
doing it, we're hating every minute, or at
yeah.
least for me.
Yep.
Like, have this
Totally.
commentary of, oh God, this is so hard. I hate this. Why am I doing this? I can't breathe,
Right.
blah, blah, blah. And then afterwards, there is that peace that, okay,
Mm,
God, I feel better. And I think that it's similar with the breath work.
yeah.
I've done a lot of breath work myself,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
what I find is that it clears away the superego, the inner critic,
Yeah.
and it clears away all of those shoulds and all of the heavy things that our brains sort of keep around us as protection,
Sure.
that kind of inform our day to day and tell us about how painful everything is and how we really screwed that up and blah blah blah. And I find that the breath work kind of clears that away, and I'm just left temporarily with just like my essence, with just me, just like,
Yeah.
okay, God, this feels better, this is soothing. But you're right, the breath work itself, at least for me and you, is like,
Yeah.
oh God, this is also confrontational and it's exhausting and
Totally.
I'm tired of it, and why am I doing this?
Yeah, yeah, it's just like, yeah, exactly. It's just like, if people have, regular meditation practice or anything, a meditation practice that's focused on, mindfulness and being in the moment, it is really, it's definitely not an easeful experience. I think it's hilarious when people are like, oh, I'll just meditate for a few minutes, before I do this or whatever. I think that's great, but also I think a lot of people assume that if you like turn on an app, a meditation app or whatever, that you're gonna like, what you're gonna confront is yourself. You're not gonna immediately find peace. And I think that you're right, though, that for me, the key is like the fact that the breath work or something like a meditation or whatever is temporary, and it's a temporary like suspended state where you aren't right, you're not kind of dealing with all of the things that your superego is, um rightfully so, is keeping in place to protect you and to try to keep you safe from, it's your brain, it's your brain keeping you safe from the world if you've been wounded. It's really
Right.
simple. And I think we can't necessarily turn that off all the time or as much as we would like to, but I do think that self-blame, getting caught in self-blame or perfectionism, as you said, is really something that I struggle with, and have really high standards for myself around. And I think that in part is why this particular period of time is has been really powerful for me and really scary at the same time. But I don't know. I'm just thinking as we were talking about. I went on a. This makes me sound like I'm constantly doing like these big self-care things, and frankly I just like am not, but I did in fact take the time to go on retreat a few weeks ago with Tara Brock, who's a mindfulness, a meditation teacher, and really interesting person. And one of the things that she said while we were there is, consider what, something like, I'm paraphrasing, but who are you if there's not a problem to solve? Something like that, right? Like, who are you if we're not racing 10 steps ahead, or in that super ego kind of like blaming the self and attacking the self, or you can do better, and like, who are we if there's just, in this moment there's not a problem to solve? And I think that's particularly poignant when you're dealing with like chronic pain or any kind of deep psychic pain, um, which a lot of people actually at this retreat were. And there is a kind of slow opening up to an as she says, like a radical acceptance of what is, and what is that right now in my life I'm, I think it's interesting to hear you kind of assess my chart and tell me what's going on astrologically, because it is what's happening in my life. It's kind of like, yes, of course, this what's happening in the stars, is it's like as above so below, right? It is what's happening. But I think that I can talk about it more easily because I am working on accepting it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, First of all, I love Tara Brach. She is one of my favorite teachers.
Mm, yeah. Yeah,
Um,
she's
yeah, her
really cool.
teachings always really, really resonate from a place of just really what my soul needs to hear. And so even your
Yeah.
paraphrasing was very poignant for me.
Mm. I think
Um,
because she's trauma informed, I mean,
yeah,
she's trained in thinking about, the psychological barriers that actually impact our capacity, certain people's capacity to engage in mindfulness practice. It's like, it's for some people, they're going internal, and inside is not a safe place at all. It's not, there's no like helpful, exciting, sweet spirit animal in there necessarily, right? It's a really fraught place. And I think she respects that, and helps give people tools to work with that complexity. Yeah. So, yeah, she's deeply resonant for me too.
yeah, that's a really beautiful way to describe her. And, I also feel like part of what I'm really drawn to with her is the sort of the reminders to come back into just a state of presence. And that
Mm-hmm.
is really hard for people that have had trauma, because the state of presence, for me anyway, largely exists in just being with my body and
Yeah.
sort of dropping my attention out of my ever spinning mind and just sort of being with what is here right now.
Mm,
Oh, my legs are crossed and it's uncomfortable. And oh, I
yeah.
haven't been taking deep breaths, and wow, it feels much better to breathe. And, those kind of practices for me have been really, really helpful. I know that often when I have physical pain or, chronic pain, that it's often sort of my body's way of calling me back in, even though I don't really want to sit with the pain and I don't appreciate the pain being
Sure.
there. There's
Mm-hmm.
this sort of like beckoning to just come back, just be
Mm,
right here with this. And so I'm curious, you raised a great point about people, their bodies not being safe and not feeling good and not finding a sparkly, fairy in their guiding. So how do you have things that you share with clients to say, ways to help them become more present with
mm,
their physical bodies, but without re-traumatizing them?
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of my life's work in a way, figuring that out, how to do that, more and more effectively. I think it has to start. I think my first response is that it has to start with me, and how I'm showing up for my my clients. In the sense that if I don't have, if I'm not grounded, or I haven't, like, kind of resourced myself in a way, which just basically for me, I'm still learning about what that means, but it means, you know, really taking care of myself in all the ways that I try to do, rest and hydration, and like, just simple things, making sure that my needs are met. But if I can do that and I can show up with as much spaciousness as possible, I think part of what really can help is initially, for people who've experienced or are continuing to be really triggered or feeling unsafe in their bodies, is to be in the presence of someone who um, feels like that's okay, and isn't. Um, a lot of people, I think, have end up sort of exacerbating their internal wounds because they try to make them smaller. Um, and I think that part of the initially, it's learning to just trust that if you're having big anxiety or big feelings of fear or pain in your body, then be around people who validate that and spend time around, environments that support that, as much as you can. And so I think that's where I start with my clients, is just a kind of a space in which I'm not anxious or I'm not judgmental or I'm not fearful because someone is having big feelings or having complex feelings. And they don't have to take care of me in the process of me kind of showing up for them. So I think that's a really long process. I'm still learning that myself with, my therapist or, the people that support me. Is I'm still learning how to bring more of myself to healing spaces or conversations. And I think a lot about parts, and I think that's something that um I use a lot with my patients, and also something that's resonated for me personally. And we can talk. I mean, there are many different lineages of this notion of being constituted of many different parts. I mean, from a psychological perspective, it's, there's a lot in attachment theory around like the different parts of the self, that are wounded. But in and there's, internal family systems is something that's been very popularized recently in kind of pop psychology, where um different parts of oneself are kind of showing up as protectors or as, the wounded part. And so there's different ways to engage in the discourse of parts. But I tend to just, with my patients, I think I work a lot with people who have struggled with eating disorders or disordered eating, and who also often have experienced sexual trauma or other forms of attachment trauma, and also potentially have, a lot of body image issues or struggles, gender dysphoria, many layered aspects of why being in a body is hard. And so I say all that to say that, this kind of idea of recognizing the different parts, and I think it is really helpful. It kind of grounds me, and it grounds my clients in the reality that if there is a part of you that is deeply wounded and suffering, there often is another part of you, like an adult part or an emerging adult part, that has the resources to sort of take care of that. I mean, in some ways people, could talk about it as like your inner child or but I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's not just your, quote unquote inner child. It's more, the part of you that was wounded as a child, but there's also a part of you that was probably really resilient or strong or interesting or like to read comic books as a child, right? Like
Yeah.
there's lots of nuance to it. And I think if we can that's often what I'm doing with my patients, is bringing more parts of the self to the table so that we can kind of see the totality of the person. And in that way, I think that's a good entry point to being in the body. So there may be parts of the body on the physical plane, like there may be parts of the body that really need to stay locked down and inaccessible. And that plays out a lot, I think, in relationships and intimacy and sexual relationships. So that has to be a slow process too. But the idea, I guess, is coming back to Tarbrock and to like mindfulness based practices. I think the idea for me is to both recognize what exists in the present moment, so simple grounding exercises, and also acknowledge that in the present moment you're being, kind of visited or haunted by a child part that's really wounded and needs a tremendous amount of something, whatever it is. What do they need? Do they need soothing or comfort or reassurance, or do they need to scream in a pillow? Do they need to, asking those questions that child was probably never asked, right? So inquiring about what unmet needs exist still, is another. So that whole language can be really helpful, and you can do that for yourself. You know what I mean? You can kind of, you don't have to meditate to be able to do that. You can sit quietly or ask a friend, ask someone who really knows you well to help you engage in some kind of process like that. Like remind me of the like remind me all, like, what do I like doing as an adult, or ask a sibling, like, what did I like doing as a kid, and bring that in as a kind of way um of integrating the multiplicity of your experience, so there isn't so much flooding with physical psychic wounds. So that's another thing. I'm trying to think, like, yeah, I think it's so I think what I'm talking about is sort of setting a frame around safety and grounding that is really complicated and nuanced. And I think that's why I'm so critical of a lot of like spiritual bypassing stuff, like the law of attraction teachings or things like that, where those aren't trauma informed teachings, because our entire being becomes splintered when we've experienced trauma in our bodies, and certainly early childhood trauma. So there may be a part of oneself that is capable of, like sitting in meditation, but all of a sudden you have a panic attack while you're meditating and you don't know why, right? And then we have to deal with that. And so I guess, yeah, in some ways it is a lot of, I don't officially do body work, right? I don't put my hands on people's bodies. I don't, and I think, I mean, I refer out. I do lots of complementary kind of treatments with people for sure. Acupuncture is, for me personally and for many of my patients, has been an amazing kind of addendum to what we're doing. Craniosacral work, it just depends on what people are comfortable with, but lots of body work is wonderful. But I think that I don't do body work, but I'm centering the body in the experience of having these conversations about trauma.
Yeah, thank you for that. That
Mm.
was really beautifully said. And
Mm.
it occurs to me that in astrology, we look at, it's very much parts work. And
Yeah.
there are, when we look at
Interesting.
all of these
Yeah.
different things, it's so,
Mm.
I always say this to clients, you're not going to say I'm decisive and spontaneous and dominant and leave it at that, because you might have that in your chart, but then you also have these, soft places that are shy and gentle and spongy.
Right.
And it's like, it sort of depends on how we learned to navigate when we were younger. Some of us, that
Right.
softness was the protection. And some of
Right.
us, we had to really be very boundaried. And, even in looking at your chart as you're talking, you have Neptune in relationship to your moon, which suggests a very, very soft, empathic ability to really feel things that aren't spoken. Right.
Mm.
So, and then you also have your sun in connection to Saturn, which suggests that that's where the boundaries come in. And so I can see, even in your chart, you've got these two super distinct places, and those are only two places where you're, you have this sort of connection to the unconscious, to things that are happening in, the different, different realms, emotion,
Yeah.
blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah. And then you also have that part of you that is like, I'm going to be very boundaried and not going to
Mm.
go there. And, I think
Mm.
that it also makes me think that this probably helps you be a really amazing therapist, because you
Mm.
have the ability to sort of have knowing, even when things
Yeah.
aren't necessarily spoken. And yet at the same time, like you shared, you have really been practicing getting present and really just
Mm.
sitting and being able to hold space, so that the reaction, or whatever's happening with your client isn't impacting you and making you break down, making your client feel like, oh shit, now I've got to like take care of my therapist. And,
Yeah.
and that happens all the time, not necessarily with therapists, but like with our parents, with, the people that we think should be holding the space for us, that we then have to, kind of tend to and mother, and it gets very confusing. And
sure.
So, that's just sort of my reflections on what you just shared. But
no, I love that. I love that idea of astrology as parts work. I don't know why I didn't quite think of it in that way, but I'm just thinking like super, the way in which astrology kind of has entered into popular culture currently. And I don't know. I mean, I've actually never gone. I don't think I've ever gone on a date with someone, and maybe this is like particular to queer community, but like I've never gone on a date with someone where I'm not immediately being asked like, what's your sign, or what, like whatever. And it's like a sort of an attempt to zero in on something. But I think what you're saying is really poignant, which is to say that like we are a multiplicity, and if you're not whipping out the full astrological chart, you're really not getting to know someone, right? And it's so complex. So yeah,
I think astrology has gotten a very bad rap because there are many ways to kind of dumb it down. But if you have a good astrologer who is less attached to the definitions and the specific archetypes, and somebody that can really say, this is, God, there's so many ways to read these planets.
Sure.
Hundreds of ways. And what I'm always interested in is, how does this show up for you? And what kind of wisdom can we get out of these that will help you? And and that is astrology. It's like with your psychotherapy practice, none of this is you can't just describe somebody in a session, or you can't just look at somebody's natal chart and describe them in the same way that you can't sit down and have a single session with somebody and send them away healed of all of their trauma. It's layers, just so many layers that that require work in between, right? Like you go to your session and then you have to actually do the work that was sort of brought up, and then you come back and you kind of reintegrate. And so I think that's just a good thing for anybody that is listening that has felt this sort of that desperate feeling of like, am I ever gonna understand this? Is
right.
That
like how do we get traction with this? It's right.
It's a process, and it's always being revealed.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this was really amazing to talk to you. Thank you so much, Asher.
Oh, it's been great. I love it. Thank you.
So if people want to find you and people want to listen to your podcast, how do they do that?
Well, that's super exciting. The idea of more people listening to my podcast. It's actually, an emerging podcast. So I am interested in all kinds of feedback or ideas and contributions as well. But so people can find me. The podcast is called Living in This Queer Body, a podcast about barriers to embodiment and how our collective body stories can bring us back to ourselves. And you can find out lots about me on Instagram at Living in This Queer Body. And you can also go to livinginThisQueerBody.com, where you can find out about the podcast, more about me, working with me, workshops, things like that. So those are the two places where I'm found.
Awesome. And you do quite a bit of long distance work. Like you work with people over the phone and over the internet too, right? So they don't just have to be local to be able to work with you one-on-one.
Right. Yeah. There's definitely opportunities for working virtually. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. And I really do look forward to listening to your episodes as you begin to release them.
Oh, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate that.
All right. Bye, Asher.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for being here with me and listening. If you are interested in helping me, leave a review. You can leave us a star review, you can leave us a word review, but the reviews really help get the episodes and the podcast in general seen by more people. And if you want to ask me questions, give me feedback, if you have show ideas, or if you're interested in coming on the show, you can find me on my website, nathacampanella.com, or find me on Instagram at natha_campanella_astrology. Oh, and recommend this podcast to friends that you think might like it too.